On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I would like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose have gone back to hosting in-person events along with our virtual book events, partnered events, trips, and classes, so please check our website for a full list. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Please turn off or silence your cell phone so as not to disturb the event. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone over here by the pillar before asking your questions. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them right behind the cash registers out front. And we will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, please line up again by the pillar over here. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So now on to the main event. I am honored to introduce C.W. Goodyear to all of you. Mr. Goodyear, a fresh new voice in the field of narrative biography, is a best-selling author and historian based in Washington, D.C. He was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, and grew up abroad before graduating from Yale University. This evening, he will be talking about his new book, President Garfield, From Radical to Unifier. In this comprehensive and authoritative new biography, Goodyear presents the multifaceted presidency of one of the unlikeliest people to ever rise to the position, progressive firebrand and conservative compromiser, Union war hero and founder of the first Department of Education, Supreme Court attorney and abolitionist preacher, mathematician and canalman, crooked election fixer and clean government champion, congressional chieftain and gentleman farmer, the last president to be born in a log cabin, the second to be assassinated. James Garfield is all of this and more. And within the pages of this book, you will get to know him. As Kirkus writes in their review, Goodyear relates his subject in fascinating, comprehensive detail, a masterful portrait of a man of great intellect, patience, and ability who should not be overlooked by history. Tonight, Mr. Goodyear will be in conversation with General Stanley A. McChrystal, former commander of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan, and former leader of Joint Special Operations Command. He is also the co-founder of the McChrystal Group and author of My Share of the Task, a memoir, Team of Teams, New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World, Leaders, Myth and Reality, and Risk, a User's Guide. Everyone, let us all welcome C.W. Goodyear and General Stanley A. McChrystal.
Charlie, well, first, thanks for letting me be here. Let me say to everybody here, thanks for coming tonight. And before we start talking about President Garfield, I want to talk about somebody else that's pretty important, and that's the guy that's sitting to my left right here. In reality, President Garfield has been passed for a century and a half. And I predict with great confidence everyone in this room and other people are going to hear a lot more from and of Charlie Goodyear, and that's how I know him. Now, let me tell you how I got to know him. He was a high school senior, and he was put in contact with me because he was doing a paper on unconventional warfare. So he reached out to me. We spoke. I was teaching at Yale at the time. He came to Yale. He took my course. He was amazing in the course. When he finished that, he was asked by, well, I recommended you to Chris Fussell, my partner at McChrystal Group, who was about to start a new book, to partner with Charlie to write it. And so they wrote a book called One Mission together. And it was extraordinary because I got to watch Charlie as he goes through the writing process. And it's ugly. He worked from our offices and he bought this contraption. It's a pillow that you wrap around your head and Velcro your head inside of it. And so when you sleep on the floor, no matter how you roll around, you've still got the pillow there. You can imagine, okay, now this is sort of the gnome who lived in our offices during this book. Came out, extraordinary book. As soon as they finished, we decided to write another book, some colleagues and I, and we started a book about leaders and immediately grabbed Charlie to work that project. And so he'll remember for more than a year, about 18 months, every Sunday morning at 6 o'clock, because that was the only time we could get everybody together, we would do these calls. There were 6 of us we do these calls and coordinators. We wrote about people like Martin Luther of the Protestant Reformation, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, Robert E. Lee, and of course Charlie led on Walt Disney. He recommended Coco Chanel for the book, and it became another chance to partner with someone to watch their intellect, to watch their judgment, and to watch their work ethic. And so, Charlie, you've become like a relative to my wife and I, and I'm extraordinarily proud to be with you today. So let's talk about President Garfield.
Yeah, that's quite the introduction. A lot of that takes me back to a lot of good memories and then a few bad ones. I didn't know that the ostrich pillow would become your defining memory of me in some ways. But before so I think actually that's like why Garfield is a good question, and I actually have a bit of Shakespeare to read that helps explain that. And the excerpt goes like this: "I will find where truth is hid, though it were hid indeed, within the center." And that's a line from Hamlet that minority leader James Garfield wrote in his diary for July 5th, 1878. So 145 years to this day, probably not far from here. So about 5 years ago, when we were working together, I was interested as a writer in finding a period of our national history where the social conditions were not totally analogous, but somewhat comparable to our own today. But somebody was leading the nation in a way that defied that divisive spirit. So I was drawn to Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, which were easy to study in DC. And throughout that period, which spanned, over decades, I found the same person lurking in the background of every major event of that time for the most part. And more distinctively, he was somebody who everybody was saying vaguely nice things about, sometimes in passive-aggressive ways, but nice things about regardless. And that figure was James Garfield. And then when I looked at the historical record, it seemed a bit thin. It was the things that were written about him were mainly, one-term president, future president, would die by assassination within the first year of his term. And the closer I got to the man, the thinner that record seemed, especially as I got into all of his papers and things. And fortunately for my research purposes, he was a hoarder. So over the course, it was a good case of trying to turn every page and knowing that that was an impossible task. But he just became more rich the deeper I got, which is great.
Well, what impressed you about him when you started to really get to know the man?
Right, yes. So he was described, even before his presidency, as one of the most impressive Americans of all time. Rutherford Hayes, who was the preceding president before him, even wrote that Garfield was one of the most accomplished Americans in history, more accomplished even than Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Franklin. And, presidents don't often say nice things about each other. So that struck me as strange that Hayes would say that about Garfield. And so when I got into the details of Garfield's life, last president to be born in a log cabin, he was raised by a single mother and then, of course, would get to the presidency. But in between those poles of his life, he had been a college president, a state senator, and an abolitionist preacher by his late 20s. So he was younger than me by the time he was all of those things simultaneously. He was also he then went on to be the youngest brigadier general at the time in the Civil War. And then halfway through the Civil War, he transitioned to being the second youngest congressman in the country. And then after that, he had a 17-year congressional career, which in those days was almost unprecedented. That was not something that anybody really pulled off. Today, of course, different standards, different times. But that was just an incredible breadth of time where he witnessed one of the most divisive and contentious periods of American history. He also was a Supreme Court attorney while serving in Congress. He regularly wrote articles for The Atlantic and the North American Review, and he also wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem in that time. So, you're reviewing that record, I felt both lazy, jealous, and intrigued about how somebody could lead a life like that. But more impressive, I think, was his style of politics. Because by the end of that career, by 1881, when he was in the presidency, he had completed this transition into being the last person who everybody in Washington could stand to be in a room with. He was the only person who had friends across the major parties. He was a Republican, but the Republican Party of that time was so terribly fractured that it was rare for any member of one faction to even be cooperative in any legislative way with another. So that all just struck me as very strange, and that conciliatoriness and that friendliness of his, that very much intrigued me, and it wasn't entirely a positive trait. That was another thing that really impressed me about him. So he just seemed like a very relevant figure who really drew me in to study.
He has this list of accomplishments that are all really impressive. Of course, the one I grabbed on was the youngest general on the Union side in the Civil War.
Yeah.
Was he a good soldier?
I think tactically he was very good. He went into the Civil War as a volunteer officer. He had been a state senator and this very active community man in rural Ohio. But he went into the Civil War because he saw within it both an opportunity for personal advancement and then the fulfillment of his own politics. He had this volcanic ambition for his background, and on the verge of the Civil War, he believed, and a lot of his friends were telling him, that it would be a tremendous opportunity for people who wanted to build a national political profile to fight in the war and to fight on the side of the Union. He had this great line that he gave when President-elect Lincoln was coming through Columbus, Ohio, and Garfield was this young, radical state senator. And he writes his friend about being surprised that this second-rate Illinois lawyer is on the verge of, essentially what everybody then, or at least a good amount, thought would be this existential civil war. And Garfield writes to his friend, this really is a fantastic time to live in, if only we can catch the cue of it. So he sensed that in the conflict to come, it would be a great way to burnish himself politically. But he was also, he had this great foresight, I think, for how the Civil War would go. He was, to back up a little bit, from a corner of Ohio that was perhaps one of the most socially progressive parts of the country. He was from the Western Reserve, which oxymoronically was the northeastern corner of the state, so that's confusing for a modern scholar. But it was an area of Ohio that had, by one measure, the highest concentration of stops on the Underground Railroad of any part in the country. And as a abolitionist preacher and as a college president at the same time, he was supporting runaway slaves going through his hometown. And you could see all of these different careers and experience of his combining on the verge of the Civil War, because he writes, as secession looks more and more likely, he writes, let's see, may it not be an economy of bloodshed to tell the South that disunion is the doom of slavery, that a society actually based on the monstrous injustice of human slavery will be a Cain among the nations of the earth. So you can hear that religious, that nice, refreshing, progressive evangelicalism, which I don't hear very much these days. And so he sensed that it would be very good for him politically. And that was the stereotype of volunteer officers back in the day. We think these days, oh gosh, all of our former presidents, they all have military experience. It was much easier when the Union had a small standing army in peacetime, because every time a major conflict came along, community men could just volunteer and become these men of influence in the ranks. And that's exactly what he did. So tactically, he ended up doing exactly as he predicted. The Civil War went precisely as he predicted in terms of becoming defined by the slavery issue, and it went for a lot longer than a lot of people expected. And he became this very famous general. He became the youngest brigadier general at the time in the Union Army, and then eventually major general. So you can't argue with that track record. But you can argue with it politically, because he did the cardinal sin, I think, of military service, which is he brought his politics into the ranks. He had joined the Union Army to be part of this liberating force going through from the north down into the south to free slaves, to break up plantation land, all that stuff. And the Union wasn't fighting that kind of war when he was in the ranks in that context. And so about halfway through, he's starting to write, I'm losing great opportunities for personal growth in the ranks. And he's seeing, but I mean, it's a heartfelt, it's this, and this is what was so difficult about him. It was this blend of personal principle and ambition. When he was touring through Alabama, he's watching slaves come running out of the fields and having to be turned away by gunpoint into back to their masters. And he writes, as these slaves are coming to see him, we seem to be as much their enemies as their masters. And he's talking about the Northern Army. And then so around this period where he's saying, really, I'm feeling the personal constraints of Army life, he's also writing very prophetically, I think, that the greater struggle of the Union will not be winning this war, will be what comes after. He has this foresight for how difficult and important Reconstruction is going to be in the legacy of this war. And then he writes later on in that letter, and I think I could better fight that battle from Congress. So, but it made me think of you, to be honest, sir, because you were my reference point for military service, and I can't help but think how bad it would be if you had a politician who was wearing an Army uniform. I think sometimes people do that still today. But do you have any experience with that at all? I don't know.
There are always a few lurking around, but I'm going to pull just a little harder on this.
Sure.
Because you write fascinatingly in your book about his relationship with his boss, General Rosecrans.
Yes, right.
Talk about that, because it's a window into a person.
Yes. So Garfield had been elected by this point. This was 1863. He'd become a congressman-elect, but he decided he still had some more glory in him to win on the battlefield. So he tries to use his personal political connections to find a good assignment, and he ends up becoming the chief of staff to General William Rosecrans of the Army of the Cumberland. Rosecrans was he was spoken of in the same breath as Ulysses Grant, and he was he was well respected, and he was this aggressive Southern commander. So Garfield thought, here it is, I can be this man's, the way in which he's able to direct this war from the front lines. And then Rosecrans, as soon as Garfield is his chief of staff, disappoints. He starts hiding in camp, the army stops moving, and all these things. And Garfield, the politician of Garfield, starts to see a way out of this. He starts writing letters to cabinet-level officials who were his friends, like Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase. And he writes, I'm just letting you know this deferral in camp is not of my doing. Rosecrans is ignoring my advice, all of that stuff. And their arc on the battlefield leads to the Battle of Chickamauga, which is a horrible bloodbath for the Union Army. It's kind of a half ambush, and it ends bloodily. And to Rosecrans' great embarrassment, there is this talk that starts on the national level, in Washington. And during this debate in Lincoln's cabinet about what to do about Rosecrans, Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase pulls out this letter, and he reads this long, withering diatribe written to him from camp where Rosecrans was, and then he says at the end, this is Chase speaking, because Chase, like a lot of great politicians, he had an actor's flair. And he writes, and this letter was written by Rosecrans' great friend, James A. Garfield. And that ends up being the end of him. And that is buried in the records for about 15 years until Garfield runs for president. And then that comes out again.
Yeah, that was not uncommon during the Civil War. There were a lot of generals writing letters about other people.
Right.
But it doesn't make it better.
No, not at all. And it complicates it, because you wonder who was at play more. Was it the politician or the person who genuinely had an opinion on how the war should be fought? And where does duty stop?
So where's the war taking us now? It's going towards its conclusion.
It is.
Which is going to mean Reconstruction.
Yes.
Paint the environment for us and then talk about where Garfield fits in.
Yeah, so the war was, by its later years, it was pretty inevitable about where it was going to end, and this great process and time period was looming up for the Union's war coalition, which was Reconstruction. It's important to remember Reconstruction as both a period and a process. It was both the period following the war, but as well as how do we remake the Union. And the great problem from the very beginning was that the Union's war coalition had no consensus on what that needed to be. Was the objective, as moderates and conservatives like Lincoln thought, to put the Union essentially back as it was minus slavery? Or was it to kind of build it from scratch, which was the opinion of radical Republicans, like Garfield, for example. And so the immediate divide in the aftermath of the war was where on this spectrum should we fall? And you could say then that the process was pretty much doomed from the beginning, because you had President Andrew Johnson, by virtue of Lincoln's assassination, being in power, and Johnson, being a white Democrat from the South, had a very different view of how Reconstruction should go from the radicals. And so it ended up starting on an awful note. And then after that contest had been settled between Johnson and the radical Republicans, the radicals then took control of the process of how to rebuild the South to make it a place that was not just free of slavery, but also one of racial equity in America. And then also another radical priority was to redistribute Southern plantation land to former slaves and what they called loyal whites, as well as to disenfranchise and execute leading Confederates. So it was as fire and brimstone as a view as you could take. And so as soon as the radicals had the power and had the freedom to try to do that, a lot of political capital had been spent. And that was because people like you and me in this room, regular voters, had started to become, by that process, tired of worrying about the South. The Union was ready to move on. And so the Johnson impeachment was the beginning of the downswing of that process. And then, as it continued on, you had legal and political and economic barriers built up. The Supreme Court ended up being a great interferer in the process of Reconstruction. And then, economically, there were just many more issues for regular Northerners to worry about. And so the Republican Party ended up finding that Reconstruction and worrying about a thorough rebuilding of the South was less and less of a winning issue at the polls. And the way politics goes is the polls are how things go. So Garfield had this great line, because he was on the front row by that period of witnessing all of this. He is the only radical who really manages the transition of that, who really takes the wind of that political movement well. He writes during the Johnson impeachment process, "I'm trying to do two things. I'm trying to be a radical and not a fool," which is very hard to pull off, and I'm paraphrasing there. But he manages this transition very well into becoming what he calls a constructive Republican rather than a destructive one. He moves away from worrying about civil rights as much. He's present to vote for the 14th and 15th Amendment, making them into law. But he starts to worry more about fiscal policy, census policy, the kind of things you'd expect from a congressman who wrote a Pythagorean theorem proof. So he deliberately chooses these fields of political work where he can distinguish himself as kind of a workhorse rather than a show horse, and he starts to tack with the times. And as a result, he's the only one president when it all falls apart in 1876.
Well, is he an opportunist, or is he a force that reaches across the different factions, particularly in the Republican Party, but across the wider electorate?
That's a good question. I think he was a pragmatist at the end of the day. He still believed in his principles, and he still believed in the greater arc of them. But his end conclusion through all of these debates and all these very tragic situations was that it would be for future generations to solve. He didn't think that those things could be addressed in his time. He actually, so part of his process was as part of Reconstruction, he founded the first federal Department of Education. And he did that because, in his words, are we to expand the bounds of citizenship in America without making any provision for the new citizens? And new citizens, he's talking about former slaves in the South as well as immigrants arriving in New York. And he writes later on, because the first federal Department of Education, it doesn't go very well. And so he eventually writes that its yields will become clear with future generations. So he has this very optimistic long-term view of the country. In terms of whether he was a good bridger of the divides or not, he wrote in the midst of all these debates that were occurring in the Republican establishment. He once wrote that to be an extreme man is doubtless comfortable. It is painful to see so many sides to a subject. So he understood, or he tried very hard to understand where everybody was coming from on a given issue. But whether that worked or not, I don't know, because they all said the same thing about Garfield, all of his critics within the Republican Party and also from the Democratic one, which was that he lacked moral backbone. That was the criticism that they kept coming on to. But you see how that makes sense from everybody's perspective. For the partisans, for the people who said that, like Ulysses Grant, like Frederick Douglass, they all said the moral backbone line. From their perspective, he was somebody who blew with the wind and could not be relied on in the heat of a political moment. And he viewed that not as weakness, though. He saw that as great strength. He thought it was easy to stay rooted in your belief. But to remain open-minded and centrist was actually the difficult thing to do. But he saw that as a necessary thing for the politics of our country in that time.
Charlie, we sometimes think of the presidency in the 19th century as being Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
And so it's a shining example of great leadership. And yet, historically, on either side of Abraham Lincoln, there are some less successful characters. How did Garfield view the presidency? How did he think about it?
He thought it was going to be a terrible waste. He didn't see the presidency by 1880 as this place for productive statecraft. He had a very cynical view of it, because by 1880 he was then the minority leader of the House, and he'd been through 4 administrations, and each of those administrations had ended in a variety of ways as poorly as possible. So he saw it as this place where productive statesmen kind of go to lose their effectiveness. It's like, well, and it's true, and I think that's held all through the times, because even today, if you're lucky as a president, you accomplish maybe 30% of your agenda going in, and there's no such thing as a president who leaves office happy. It's a realm for disappointment. So, and he had also seen throughout his years in power, he had seen mentors and friends, including Salmon Chase, become obsessed with the presidency from afar. He saw them in the midst of doing their work in the cabinet, in Congress, become infected, as he put it, with the idea that they could be president one day. And in becoming infected and becoming obsessed with the presidency and kind of seeing it almost mirage-like on their horizon, they would then lose their focus, and that they would become ineffective at politics. So Garfield saw Salmon Chase get infected with what he called the presidential fever and try to chase the presidency and fail and end up losing his career over it. The same thing happened with James Blaine, who later became a very good ally of Garfield's. And so Garfield was, by 1880, he wrote himself, "I have seen so many friends and allies become infected with the presidential fever that I swear it will never infect me." Because he thought that as soon as he bought into the idea he could be president one day, everything that made him good as a politician would just fall by the wayside. And I think that has a lot of lessons for today in some ways. But what was ironic about all of that, but by being hesitant, by being afraid, and by being this wavering, neutral, almost compromising force in a divided Republican Party by that time, he ended up setting the perfect standards for himself to be elected to the presidency. So that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
That's amazing. And he had nightmares before his inauguration?
He had a weird nightmare before his inauguration. So he had a lot of apprehension, of course. He was nominated pretty much very visibly against his will. So you go into the Republican nominating convention of 1880, and it's occurring in this glass arena in downtown Chicago, and you have all of the different Republican factions have declared candidates for the presidency. You have in one corner, and I'm describing it like a boxing ring, you have the stalwarts who are loyal to Ulysses Grant, and they want to send Ulysses Grant into the White House for a 3rd term. And then in the other corner, you have a faction that's delightfully called the half-breeds, who are united behind James Blaine. And then you have all these independent reformist candidates, and none of these candidates can get enough party support on the floor to actually win the nomination. And so Garfield has the either bad luck or cunning, rat-like cunning, to be in the right place at the right time throughout this week-long convention. And it's this remarkable mix of kabuki theater and gladiatorial combat, because this is before the primary system we have today. This is when parties go into their nominating conventions, and the public is allowed to watch as all these different candidates are giving up and all of their lieutenants are trying to rally support. So Garfield starts entering the palace being the name for this arena. He starts entering it just a little bit late, which is an actor's trick to attract attention to yourself from the public crowd. He starts, whenever there's a big spat, he always happens to stand up from the floor and say the right thing at the right time. And it's very strange, because he's such inwardly you see his writing and you see him being this hesitant person to just take the reins of power. But he also happens to be, perfectly placed for it to happen. So he's either snake bit or he's the opposite of snake bit, where he's just got perfect luck. So then the nominating convention rallies behind him at the last minute, and there are these terrible, tremendous scenes, and he ends up again leading the campaign that follows in a way that's binding these very disparate Republican factions together. But on the eve of the presidency, and this is the scene you're mentioning, he has this dream that I think defies psychologists' work. He has this dream of looking over he's lost in a thunderstorm in rural Ohio, and he's by a canal, and he used to work on the canal as a young man. That was a big part of his campaign imagery. And he looks, and he's on a canal boat then, and he's sharing it with Chester Arthur, his vice presidential candidate. And then the boat starts to sink. And James Garfield dives into the water, reaches the shore, looks back, and Chester Arthur's going down with the ship. And then Garfield moves to dive in again, and then one of his childhood friends comes out of the bush and says, "No, you're the president-elect, you can't," and sort of throws him back. And so then Garfield runs off, now naked, into the woods, and he ends up collapsing into a cabin, and then he wakes up, drenched in sweat, and his wife's not at home. And so I end that section with him wishing for his wife's presence, and then that's how it goes. So there's a lot to dive into there, but but what's great is that all of that apprehension he had, all of that hesitancy he had to grab the reins of power, all of that anxiety he clearly felt about managing the factions under his control, and then this strange nightmare he had about the well-being of himself and his running mate. It's all tremendous poetic precedence for what happens to him. He was entirely right to be afraid in such a way, because of course he ends up being assassinated. And it's all because of these things that he's worried about. So I'm not going to say it defies analysis, but it's one of those moments where as a biographer you're like, someone's writing this somewhere, and I'm like the reader of it, which is great.
We're all going to have nightmares tonight. Now, he is a compromiser.
Yes.
He is someone who people respect. Why would anybody assassinate him?
Yeah, he was assassinated. Well, that's a very good question. He was assassinated because as soon as he won the presidency, he was then given the terrible task of distributing out the spoils. And so we've all heard the phrase, "to the victor go the spoils." That phrase is actually from Garfield's time, because that was a phrase used to describe when a party won power in Washington, how would they distribute government jobs? How would they split up the spoils, the winnings of the election? Because back in those days, you didn't have really a professional civil service in America. Every single bureaucrat on the federal level, or every single public servant, was actually a political appointee. So you didn't have a professional post office worker, you didn't have a sheriff really, you didn't have a taxman. Those were all cronies who were loyal to their congressman for appointment, who in turn asked those of the president. So Garfield gets into power, and immediately he is besieged by all these different factions who are demanding their fair share. And one faction in particular, the stalwarts, who were loyal to Ulysses Grant and who had been difficult throughout the campaign, they start asking for things that Garfield didn't think he owes them. And as soon as that begins to fall apart, it ignites this ugly, ugly spat between one wing of the Republican Party and the president. And all of a sudden, all of these very touchy issues in the country get ignited, because it becomes what I write in the book as it becomes a proxy war for all of the sleeping dogs of the political system. You have in one corner the stalwarts, who are the worst practitioners of spoilsman politics on the national level, who are against a president who's trying to represent the other factions. So all the people who want clean government want Garfield to win. And then the stalwarts, their leaders were in the Senate. They were these great Senate bosses, these masters of political machines. And so that, in that way, it becomes a question of the Senate versus the White House. So this terrible spat gets kicked off. And involved in it, by the way, is Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur, who was a stalwart and who had been picked exclusively because Garfield wanted to keep the stalwarts in line in the party. And Chester Arthur had never been elected to anything in his life until he was elected to the vice presidency. So I'd argue until recently he was the least qualified executive we've ever had. But I had to change that line. So then you have this battle, this very public political battle, and the rhetoric that comes out is so toxic, and the incitement of the country is so toxic that eventually the stalwarts are defeated. The leaders of the stalwarts end up executing a terrible political maneuver against Garfield, and it backfires entirely. But in the aftermath of all of that excitement, you have a supporter of the stalwarts who is admittedly mentally ill, who then takes the fallout personally, and he blames the fight between the stalwarts and Garfield as a reflection of his own failures in life. He had really gone through quite a lot. And so he ends up deciding that if he shoots Garfield and he kills Garfield, Arthur, the stalwart vice president, would take over and would be so grateful that he would then give the shooter any job in government the shooter wanted. So you have these terrific scenes, and this is what I did as writing the book, you've read it, because this person is in the background of every major event. He's following Garfield throughout Washington, because in that time, the norms of the way our system of government worked was the president was expected to be an average citizen outside of their office. They were expected to ride public transportation, to mingle on the street, to do their own errands. And so when you have Garfield going to church, if you looked out his window, or if he looked out his window, he would see the assassin there looking up at him, aiming a pistol. Or following him and the Secretary of State a few steps behind on the street. And this culminates in the assassin shooting Garfield in the Baltimore and Potomac railway station, which used to stand on the mall. It's now been torn down. Everything Garfield related has a bad habit of being torn down. But he gets shot in the back. And because of, and we'll talk more about the fallout later, but it is this transcendently important moment in American political history, and it has this revolutionary effect on a lot of things we wouldn't expect.
Right, but we're only going to have one more question for you and I,
man.
because we're going to open it. So what I'm going to ask you to do, though, is tell us how we should think about Garfield. We should be naming our sons and daughters after Garfield?
Yeah, people already have, so they've beaten us to it. They don't need our permission. I think the two things that I've taken away from his life, and the full spectrum of it, is first that there's a lot of rhetoric these days that the events and debates that we're having about American society of our time are unprecedented. The idea of like disputed presidential elections where one party says the results are fraudulent, or or deep rhetoric about the fairness of America. And we think that these are new and that we've never had these debates or events before. And Garfield's life tells us that's not exactly true. There is, in ways, both reassuring, because we've been through it before, and not, because we've been through it before, that we have undergone these similar experiences in our past. And I think second, and this is the more complicated part of Garfield's life personally, he's a very good demonstration, I've decided, about what it looks like when a pathologically reasonable person is in power in D.C. I mean, because we often ask ourselves, I think, in the privacy of our homes, wouldn't it be great if people in Washington just got together and they did the common sense thing and they just hashed things out? Garfield's a very good look at what happens when a president and a major statesman of that time defines their approach to a situation by how can we make everybody happy? And the result is a very complex, almost chimera of a man and of a system that we get as a result. Because after all, what is compromise if not deferring our most challenging issues to the next generation? So the legacy of his reasonableness and his friendliness, I think, is very complicated. And so that's the thing I'm left thinking about. He's in my rearview mirror. Kind of. He's also over there. He's staring at me from the shelf. But you look at that, and this is what's great for a biographer, because you don't want to like your subject. I'm not sure if I like him or not. It's complex.
Well, we like the book.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right.
Let's open it up to questions. Questions, comments from anyone. And you know where the mic is, and if you can,
Yeah.
please approach it.
Well, I'm close to the mic, so I'll
All right.
grab it first. Just wondering about, well, especially during this week that you spoke of, and I guess right about when the Republican Party's trying to come up with their candidate. And I'm just wondering what his speeches were like then, if he was so ambivalent about being president. Was he sort of overcoming that ambivalence and speaking forcefully for his own case, or not?
He wasn't speaking for his own case. He was not. He was speaking entirely through in the voice of party unity. So what happened over the course of this week in Chicago was periodically these factions would try to either rig the rules of the game, or they would actually try to kick each other's delegates out. And every time that happened, Garfield would stand up and he would give this ringing defense of the individual's republicanism. And he would phrase these things in a way that would emphasize party health rather than personal well-being. Also, it was a great faux pas of that time to be personally endorsing yourself as a presidential candidate. That was seen as something that would be a surefire way to have no one go in. So you're left yearning, I think, a little bit these days for a little bit more of that. But I don't know how we put that back in its box.
So is he speaking about the future Democratic opposition at all in this?
He is, yeah. He's saying if we are to win in November, it's going to be done as a united party. And so we don't have the luxury, really, of being in the situation and picking who is a good Republican and who is not. What matters is winning. Even the endorsement speech for the candidate that he wanted or that he was the manager for in the convention hall, he doesn't describe him by name. He just says, you know this man by his achievements, and he lists all of these things that, here's another little tidbit, he names the candidate so vaguely that people think that Garfield could be, in theory, referencing himself, but he never overtly says that. And so it's another example of him just threading the line beautifully. Like a lot of very good politicians of all time, he pretended that he was a bad one, and that made him very appealing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, sounds very different than now.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for writing this book. I'm a high school history teacher, and my colleagues and I, for many years, have said we wish there were a biography of James Garfield, and there hasn't been one.
Great. I'm glad to hear it.
Well, good. I'm curious to know, sort of a counterfactual, why do you think that it's taken so long for someone to write a biography of James Garfield?
That's an awesome question. So there have been a lot of writings about his death, because his death was so spectacular and it was so dramatic. So he didn't, and I didn't mention this in the talk, he didn't die of the gunshot. He died of the infection. He took 80 days to die. And so it's a great way to like suspend the drama. And again, it makes you think as a biographer, somebody's planning this like from afar. But I think it goes back to how Americans remember our leaders. We tend to think, I believe, and this is natural, by the way, we look at people who have been our leaders in the past, and we ask ourselves, this person was president. What did they accomplish as president, and how can we still see that today? For Garfield, super short story, and not by his own choice. So when he has been written about, it's been this focus on the way his life ended and how it ended and the long-term impacts of that, which I haven't yet really gotten into. But the life beforehand is just an American dream story that was just so fun, really, to write through. And his level of writing was just wonderful as well. You know, I opened with that Shakespearean quote. He opened every day of his diary entry for 1878 with a different Shakespearean quote. And so when you have a statesman who not only knows Shakespeare, but who's able to apply it to his day-to-day life, you know somebody who's operating at the right level. And so that's what made him so rich and fun to me. It also led to the easiest editorial decision of my life, leaders aside, which is I opened every chapter in the book with a different Shakespearean quote from a different day that he chose, because he had so many that related to his life. I just thought it was perfect. But I'm glad that there are some. I know there are a lot of diehard Garfield fans. I keep on finding little pockets of them.
Well, all of my colleagues and I are. So
nice.
I guess we all wish there were one. Thank you so much.
That's perfect. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Hey there. Thanks for doing this. This is a quick one, but it might be tough. If you could relate him to any political figure within the last 20 years, 30 years, who's the most Garfield-esque?
Not tough at all, actually, because there are some reviewers that have already written reviews that have done this, which is great. People compared Rutherford Hayes, who was the person preceding Garfield, to Jimmy Carter. And what's great about that is that Garfield has also been compared now to Gerald Ford, as somebody who was elected he hadn't been elected, but Garfield is still the only president to be directly elected from the House. But Gerald Ford was a House member, and who was then made vice president because Spiro Agnew had been, done what Spiro Agnew did, and so the result was Gerald Ford was turned to as this person who every Republican vaguely liked, who had legislative experience and who could be counted on to be this kind of technocratic behind-the-scenes figure, and so that's the comparison that a lot of people actually have now made now that the book is out, which is great. And I wouldn't have thought of that, so I can't claim that as my original idea.
Is there any of your personal connections that you made to maybe even more recent than Gerald Ford, in the last 20 years, that you personally made a connection to?
One of the things that's nice about this book is that the party identities matter less. And so I'm one of the reasons I was interested in this, because I was trying to get a little bit away from the modern Sturm und Drang. I was trying to get people to think more about the issues without party labels, and so I want to avoid getting too meta on it.
Fair enough.
I did find a family connection, but I can't talk about this now because I want to give the.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate it.
I'm going to keep him on the hook for just a second because we were having dinner not long ago and we were talking about a current politician, and you described him just quickly as saying about 30% of a conscience.
I really can't say any further. I'm
No,
sorry. I'm really sorry.
Did Garfield have a conscience? How do you think about that?
Absolutely. He wrote beautifully and with such soul and with such meditation on what he called the destiny of the Republic. That's a phrase lifted from his inaugural address. He definitely did have a conscience, and he thought, and I can't compare him really to any modern figure in terms of just the depth of thought of that intellect that made him so fun to deal with. And so I think he does. I don't know if the direct comparison is there, but I appreciate it.
I was curious, with the assassinations, usually accompanies a conspiracy. But
Yes.
in this case, it looks like an obvious case of a lone wolf. Did they, at the time, think it might be a conspiracy, or was it pretty obvious?
Absolutely, they did. Because you know what? The assassin at the scene, he had his motivations because he said he wanted the vice president elected. He also said at the scene, "I am a stalwart, now Arthur will be president." so immediately, the whole country was like, oh, clearly this is the stalwarts trying to kill, seize power. It was dispelled very quickly, though, which is very interesting because the assassin was so obviously mentally unwell that the public response was, well, clearly this man is not a part of a political cabal. No one would trust this person. And the response of the stalwarts, Chester Arthur became a tearful wreck because he was not only saddened, he genuinely liked Garfield, he was also terribly afraid of becoming president. He didn't sign up for that. He just wanted to have fun because he was this corrupt boss figure. He was like, oh, great, I get to do it's an opposite problem than a lot of vice presidents have. He's like, no work and all of this pomp and ceremony, fantastic. And so that's exactly what he did. But the way the public responded to the shooting, because the shooter was a stalwart sympathizer, but he wasn't a stalwart. But the way the voters responded was by punishing the stalwarts and kicking them out of power, because they blamed the faction for what their rhetoric had caused somebody to do, rather than what they had done themselves. And that is very interesting, I think.
Excellent. Thank you.
No problem.
I've lived in Washington a long time, but I realize I don't have the answer to this question.
Oh.
Is there anything marking the spot or near the spot of his shooting? The railway station is gone, but is there anything covering the spot?
Railway station is gone. It's been replaced by another Smithsonian, because that's what happens with everything on the mall. There was a plaque within that that railway station that has now gone missing. No one knows where it went. And there's actually Senator Chris Murphy, who is a Williams graduate, and Garfield was also a Williams graduate, so that's the connection there. Senator Chris Murphy is trying to get a new marker placed, but you can imagine the legislative hurdles to that. But there is, if you go to the Capitol building, on the southwest corner of the Capitol, there's a Garfield statue in the middle of a roundabout that everybody misses because it's in the middle of the roundabout. And then there's another statue of him in Statuary Hall. So he's in a lot of places you wouldn't expect to look. There's also a Johnny Cash song written about him. So you got to find the right, look in the right places, and you'll see a lot of memorials.
I'll check out that song.
Yeah,
Thank you.
all right, appreciate it.
I just want to say thank you first both for doing this. This has been a great event.
Oh, thanks.
The presidency is a very exclusive group of people, but I think what's even more exclusive is the list of presidents who have been assassinated. It's only been 4 people out of 46. So I wonder if you see, by studying Garfield, any through lines between those 4 assassins. Is there any commonalities in their time periods, like any evidence of like what's kind of tying them together, if anything?
Will's too shy to mention it. He knows me personally, and he's one of the smartest guys I've ever met, so he knew the right question to ask. So he knew how to give me a hard one. So an interesting commonality, which is a surprise to a lot of people, was Robert Todd Lincoln. Robert Todd Lincoln was the sole surviving son of Abraham, and I know this isn't the angle you were looking for. He was Garfield's Secretary of War as well, because Garfield was then trying to keep the Republican Party reminding of its heritage and things like that. So he made his Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln, who had just been a regular attorney. And so Robert Todd Lincoln had this great line at the end of his life. He said, "No one ever wanted me for anything. They wanted Abraham Lincoln's son," which is terribly sad. But Robert Todd Lincoln was there when Garfield was shot, and he saw the shooting. And as Secretary of War, he was in charge of securing the scene. And then he gives this quote to a reporter, and he said, "How many hours of suffering I've seen in this town." And then you fast forward to the McKinley administration. Robert Todd Lincoln shakes McKinley's hand because Robert Todd Lincoln had just been ambassador to Britain. And then he finds out that McKinley's just been shot. and so Lincoln then later said, "I refuse to meet any further presidents. They have a so he said verbatim, events have a certain fatality when I meet them." So it's weird, the historical lines that you find that thread all these things together. The reaction to Garfield's assassination was not unlike the Kennedy assassination. People built him into what he was not. There's this hero vision of him that isn't matching the facts. That's a great question.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think what you just said might be a partial answer to what I wanted to ask. My grandmother was named for Garfield.
Fantastic.
So her name was Esther Garfield. And my great-grandfather who lived on the border state of West Virginia, part of it that was either Confederate or Union, depending on
that murky
your
area.
luck.
Yeah, right.
Yes. But he named several of his children unambiguous names like Sherman. But I have no record of why he named them the various names, though there's strong clues such as that one. But I am so interested in what you said about his personal character, and I think as a biographer you psychoanalyzed him, but I'm interested in what his public image was that would lead my great-grandfather to name him, name her for him when other children got names like Sherman.
Yes.
So what was his public image? What did people think about him?
Yeah. Well, so first, by the end of his presidential campaign, he had been like the whole romance of his life, starting on the canal and then ending up in the White House, that had been milked to death in the public sphere. So everybody thought of him through campaign imagery as this epitome of the American dream, this unlikely fulfillment of our national ideals. So you have that at the beginning. He was also personally very popular in Washington because everybody considered him a friend. He respected institutional precedent, and he would make these bipartisan gestures and friendships all the time. And then you combine that with his assassination, and you create the perfect conditions for a hagiography. And so what was interesting is in the aftermath of his passing, Garfield becomes the symbol, the nationwide symbol for clean government reform. His death becomes identified as the impetus for the first Civil Service Reform Act passed in a major level in the Republic, and it's called the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. And it had all these weird ideas about jobs in the government beginning to be awarded based on something called merit. And the bosses were freaking out because now they couldn't use their currency anymore, and there would be competitive exams that would decide the placement of 25% of all of U.S. public jobs. And civil servants are now not allowed to participate in political campaigns. So all of the bosses are tearing their hair out. But the reformers knew the power of Garfield as a symbol. And so they dedicated the passage of the act to him, and his poster was in every single post office in the country. And actually, a historian of the reform movement wrote, "Garfield dead was more useful than Garfield alive," because in practice, the compromise that he was, Garfield was actually he had no qualms really about using patronage where it suited him. That's how he bought the allegiance of a lot of personal loyalists. That's how he got the stalwarts on board with the campaign. But he also said vaguely nice things about reform, too. And he would get reformists, activists in a corner. He would say, "You're being too militant, and you're being too vocal and criticized." So the result is the factors were perfect to make him just exactly the kind of person you want to name your child after in the aftermath of his death. And I find people like you everywhere.
So more that than race, or
the race thing, he had very good writings on that, and he believed in public education. And as president, actually, he made a point of going to Howard University's law school graduation and giving out the diplomas himself. He had very optimistic views on the future course of race relations in the country. He also gave jobs to Frederick Douglass, Bruce Blanche. He wanted to give a lot of European ambassadorships to Black Americans. But he was killed before that could happen. So his views on that were certainly helpful. But so this is interesting. The cat, Garfield the cat, was named because the cartoonist's, I think, grandfather was also named in honor of James Garfield. So when the cartoonist wanted to attach a fuzzy name to this lazy feline, he was like, "That reminds me of my grandfather," who was named after the president, who was not lazy in the slightest, as his record shows.
very funny.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, Charlie, good to see you. I haven't
thanks.
read the book yet, but you tell a great story, so I'm looking forward to reading it. You know, the title, you sort of posed a dichotomy. He was a radical. He came out with strong politics. He had strong policy views as a young man. Then later he was willing to trade those. Where did his radical politics come from? His mother, his neighbors, his upbringing? Where did they come from?
It was his upbringing for sure, I think. The Western Reserve of Ohio, they called it the Gibraltar of abolitionism because of how much anti-slavery politics there
It
was.
was actually
there.
the western end of the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, it
originally.
was. That's right.
That's why it's the Western Reserve.
That's why it's the Western Reserve, because it was reserved for Connecticut,
Yeah.
and then Ohio took it. So unfortunate. But no, his racial politics are amazing when you read his writing and how he believed in that. He was not afraid of injecting religious imagery and civic religion into how he talked about the need for the U.S. to be a racially equitable republic. He wrote, and he had these great speeches on the House floor in the mid-Civil War, and he got to be, I had fought, I'd been there freeing the slaves and all that stuff, but then he also had these moments where he said, Mr. Speaker, and this is, I'm remembering, it has long been a part of my thinking that this great war upon us was divine will. And it was a way to teach America, to punish America for its sin of not providing full reparations to the black man. It was this, he thought the Civil War was divine will to punish America for its inequities. And that's really interesting to see, especially being from a blue-collar, working-class white background. That was very interesting to me. And then he cooled down, and he became much more of an appreciator that politics is the art of the possible in America. And there's a lot to admire there. There's also a lot of tragedy about it. But he was fascinating on that issue. So thanks, Nelson. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. You mentioned the civil service sort of came from his death. What would have happened had he lived?
He would have very politely asked Congress to do something about it. He said in his inaugural address he endorses universal public education. He says outrages in the South cannot be tolerated, but I'm going to act within my constitutional limits. He also says it would be a good idea to build a canal between Atlantic and Pacific somewhere in Central America. So you read that and you're like, oh my gosh. But he also says at the very end of his speech, because he knew how contentious it was going to be, he says, I would like to ask Congress to consider instituting term limits for our civil servants and rules of conduct that can be enforced when I please. And so he had as gentle a view of it as possible. So people at the time at his death, they said that his death catapulted the reform movement forward by 30 years. That was the time limit they placed on it. So it's hard to get too far into hypothetical history. I don't think he would have been terribly successful at monumentally changing our system. He would have been, as he was by that point, an incremental improver of our society. But, yeah, no problem.
I'm going to take the privilege of asking the last question.
Sure.
You've become a historian. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I think I fall somewhere on the spectrum of historians because there are a lot of historians out there. I see myself as being more of a popular historian than anything else. My objective is not necessarily to be writing theses and to be standing up to, peer review. I'm trying to imbue scholarly thoroughness to issues in a way that can appeal to the American public, and I think this is a good time for that. There are a lot of, I'm going to be careful with what I say here. There are a lot of presidential biographers who look very different to me in age. Presidential biography is typically the place for the people who are already esteemed in American writing. And there seems to be a bit of a generational gap. And that was what got me interested in this idea in the first place. And when I pitched Simon & Schuster on this idea, I think that was part of the reason they said yes, was because they were kind of looking around and thinking it might be a nice time for a younger view of American history. But I think we're going to now start to see a lot of people taking new angles of view on new figures from our history. And they're going to they might be close to my age range. They're also going to look very differently from me. So I like to think that we're on the verge of a great diversification of how we view American history and our different types of leaders. You know, I don't think I'm going to be a major part of that, but it was certainly a fascinating topic, and it was liberating to be able to dive so deep into so compelling a life.
Well, I think you could be a major part of a lot of things going forward. And
Yeah,
I want to
thank
thank you personally for your friendship, but also for the wisdom and the gift of this book
Oh, thank
for
you.
all of us here. And please join me in thanking Charlie for the night.
I appreciate it.